We're looking at Judaism in our study. Page 10, Judaism. Now, why in Old Testament theology do we have the study of Judaism? And why is it at this point? Well, we must study Judaism for the simple reason that you cannot understand many things in the New Testament apart from understanding what took place between the Testaments. In order to understand the New Testament, we have to have some understanding of the rise of Judaism between the Testaments, between Malachi, say about 420 BC and the time of Christ, which would be the beginning of the calendar in both directions for Christians. Now just think of the significance of what I said for a moment. In the New Testament, many things just suddenly appear without any explanation. And they're not in the Old Testament historical record. So where did they come from? Which shows you why it's necessary to study the rise of Judaism. What things am I talking about? Well, things like the synagogue. It's not in the Old Testament, but it's in full bloom in the New from the beginning. So where did it come from? We're going to study that in detail. The Sanhedrin, religious parties of Pharisees, Sadducees. Then there's a lot of Jewish literature that is there from the New Testament period on, like the books of Maccabees, which have quite important history for Israel between the Testaments. So it's necessary in Old Testament theology or Old Testament study somewhere to study the rise of Judaism. I recognize that most people, when you say Judaism, you just think, well, that's the religion of Israel. But there's more to Judaism than just that. There are several kinds of Judaism, and we have to come to an understanding of where did this legalistic Judaism arise. There were no Pharisees back during David's time or Ezra, Nehemiah's time. There was not legalism then. Obeying the law is not legalism in the Old Testament dispensation. It would be in the New. But the time we get to the Gospels and the epistles, both Jesus and Paul, the apostles, are charging the Pharisees and the religious leaders with the worst kind of legalism and bondage. Where did it come from? Well, let's look first of all tonight at the term. First of all, the term. The term occurs first in the book of Maccabees, 2nd Maccabees, 2:21 and 14:38, term Judaism. 2:21, 14:38. Now, anybody who's serious about Old Testament studies should have an Apocrypha. It's not Scripture, but especially the two books of Maccabees will give you quite an understanding of some things. What Jews believed in the 2nd century before Christ. There are doctrines there that show you the trend of Jewish thought. So that's where it first appears. And here in Maccabees, Judaism, the term signifies the religion of the Jews as contrasted to Greek Hellenism. Greek Hellenism or culture. In the 2nd century BC, the world had been conquered by Alexander the Great. That is, it was Greek culture at that time. He conquered it before that, but it was Greek culture at that time. Judaism, as it occurs in the books of Maccabees, refers to the Jewish religion as contrasted to Greek culture, Hellenism. Now the word is used in the New Testament, and there the term we see is used to contrast the non-Christian Jewish religion with Christianity. It occurs that way in Galatians 1:13. You might want to turn there just to get an idea of how this term, which later came to signify legalism to any Christian, how it's used here. This is an example. Galatians 1:13. For you heard of my life in times past in the Jews' religion. Now there's the term Judaism. The Greek is IOUDAIS M-O-S. Judaismos. I-O-U-D-A-I-S-M-O-S. Now, that occurs several times in the New Testament. And it means Judaism, just what subject we're dealing with. It occurs in Titus 1:14, translated there Jewish tales. Titus 1:14. In Galatians 2:14. And he's referring there to Jewish customs, literally to Judaize the Gentiles. And then in Acts 10:28, it's translated a Jew. Term Jew is used. Judaismos. Now in the Hebrew there is no term that can be translated like this we just gave you as Judaism. In the Old Testament there's no term for Judaism, but there is a Hebrew word, and sometimes it's used as the name of a person, and it's Yehudi. That's Y-E-H-U-D-I. And it means Jewish as an adjective, or can be translated as a noun, Jew. Yehudi can be either a noun or adjective, Jewish or Jew. And that occurs all through the Old Testament. I'll just give you a few references. Yehudi is in 2 Kings 16:6, Esther 5:13, Nehemiah 1:2, many places. But that still doesn't give us the origin of the term. The term comes from the southern kingdom of Judah. That's where we're getting Judaism and Yehudi and Jew. Jew comes from Judah, the kingdom of Judah. The Jew was originally a Judean from the southern kingdom of Judah, J-U-D-A-H, Judah. And then over the years, after the exile, after the nation was destroyed and carried into exile, Yehudi came to designate anybody that was a Jew, whether they lived in the north or south. It was no longer geographically limited just to the southern kingdom of Judah, with Jerusalem as the capital city. But after the exile, then Yehudi can mean anybody that's a Jew, just an adherent to Judaism. Now, we have to make a distinction from the outset between legalistic Judaism and what might be called classical Judaism. In the books they speak of Hebraism. You have to make a distinction between those two, because there is nothing wrong with Ezra and Nehemiah calling the people back to the law of Moses and the worship and the ritual, the sacrifice. After the exile, you see, they've been without it for 70 years. Now they're going to start rebuilding the temple. And so you don't find legalistic Judaism in Ezra, Nehemiah, prophets Zechariah, Haggai, Malachi. You have to look for it somewhere else, a little later. That Judaism did become legalistic is obvious from reading the New Testament, both the Gospels and the epistles. But its legalism arose after Ezra and Nehemiah, when prophecy had ceased, when Israel was without a king, when she was ruled over more or less by priestly families, and during the period when mysteriously there arise parties like Pharisees, Sadducees, Hasidim, and so forth, which we'll look at later. Now I'm just going to give you some dates and maybe a sentence about it. These are some pegs to hang some biblical facts on. I don't know of any book you could get this list of dates. And they're significant because they're related to Old Testament history, the intertestamental history as well. So we're looking at the political background for the simple reason Israel didn't live or survive in a vacuum, but she was ruled over From the time of the Babylonian captivity to 1948, she was ruled over by her enemies. That is to say, either her enemies or she was scattered. That's from 586 BC to 1948. So the political background of Israel is important because it helps you to understand both Old and New Israel. All right, the biblical period. That means up through Malachi, you see, from Ezra, Nehemiah to Malachi. First of all, we have the Babylonian period, which we're acquainted with from all of our other studies. The Babylonian period in which Babylon, of course, you know, destroyed Judah, Jerusalem, the temple and all, carried the Jews captive for 70 years, 586 to 536. That's the Babylonian period, 586 to 536. Actually, to get 70 years, you have to go back a little further, but we gave you all that in Old Testament introduction and all. There were 3 captivities. The last big one was 586. That brings us to the Persian period. And in 536, the Persians have conquered Babylon and allow the Jews to return and rebuild their city and temple. 536. And Zerubbabel, who is mentioned in the book of Zechariah, he was the governor. They returned in 536 under King Cyrus's permission. The altar of burnt offering was rebuilt at this time. Remember, everything's destroyed, no sacrifices, no worship for 70 years. Ezra 3, 1-7 tells you that. The altar's rebuilt. And in 535, a year later, the foundation of the temple is laid. Ezra 3, 8-13. Then the work gets interrupted for 15 years, according to Ezra 4. They just lay the foundation to the temple, and then for 15 years they don't lay another stone. The temple isn't being built, in other words, because the Samaritans, who are their adversaries, write letters to their Persian overlords and get the work stopped. You can read it in Ezra 4. Then 520 BC, the work resumes. 15 years later, see? And the temple work resumes under the ministries of Haggai and Zechariah. Now you can understand where those prophets fit into the scheme of things. And they exhort them to resume the work, remember? And God promises blessing if they put him first and his house first, like in Malachi later. Then in 515 BC, the temple is finished. But the work of restoring the city and its walls is delayed for almost a century. 478 BC, Esther becomes queen over in Persia. And remember, the Persians are ruling over the Jews in Palestine. And historically, she's significant for Judaism because without her, there'd be no Judaism. Because she preserved, through her intercession, the nation of Israel and its worship. That's Esther 3, 12 and 13 especially. 458 BC, Ezra comes to Jerusalem as a teacher priest and leads in reforms. He's a teacher priest. Teaching has always been, since the exile, very significant in the Jewish religion. Before that, teaching was there, but it was mostly the ritual worship that was emphasized, as we told you. That's Ezra 7-10. He leads in reforms. Now if you look back at 536, you see it's not a full century, but you're talking about almost a century later. People have trouble getting Ezra, Nehemiah, Haggai, Zechariah, Malachi, Zerubbabel, Cyrus, and all of these together, and where Esther fits in and so forth. See, this helps you to see the order of events. This is after the exile. All of this is after they come back from their captivity. Then in 445 BC, Nehemiah comes to Jerusalem as governor. And he begins to rebuild the walls and the city. See, it's almost a century. It's a long time after they got back. They started building their houses. They laid the foundation to the temple. And because the devil stirred up a little opposition, they just got afraid of the Samaritans and spent their time building their own houses. And if you'll read Haggai in relationship to this, you'll find out God is concerned that they put him first, and then he'll take care of them. So Nehemiah rebuilds the walls and city amidst much opposition. They didn't scare him. It's quite interesting, Nehemiah 1-7, to see that they had to lay stones and mortar and all of that, rebuilding the walls with a sword on their side, spear in one hand and a building tool in the other. And 2 men would build and 1 would stand guard and so forth. They had many enemies besides the Samaritans. You can read all about it in Nehemiah, Arabians and so on. 433 BC, Nehemiah goes back to Babylon. Nehemiah 13:6. 432 BC, Malachi begins to preach his reforms. See, Malachi is the last prophet of the Old Testament. 425 BC, Nehemiah returns from Babylon back to Jerusalem and finds abuses among the people and initiates reforms. They put away their foreign wives and got back to faithfulness to God. He called them back to the law. Ezra is teaching, and Nehemiah, though he's the governor, yet he's the governor of Israel, which is a religious position, not just political in Israel. To summarize the nature of the worship in this period, the temple we see is restored. The walls of the city have been restored. Worship has been resumed. They're back to the sacrificial ritual that we dealt so much with that points to Christ. And the people are being taught in the Word of God and exhorted to faithfulness. Now, up to this point, you don't find any legalistic Judaism, because calling people back to faithfulness, putting away wrong marriages as God had forbidden them to do, and even the priesthood got involved in it, calling them back to the laws of Moses is not legalism in the Old Testament. It would be under grace, but not then. So we don't find it there. So let's come to the interbiblical period. You don't find it in the period of Ezra and Nehemiah, which is about a century. The interbiblical period is going to be, of course, from Malachi, the last prophet, to Matthew, or literally from Malachi to Christ. Now that's on your outline, and I'm not going to take the time to say anything about it. The interbiblical period is there with the dates on the outline. Drop down to the Seleucid supremacy under that outline and the Maccabean period. All I want to do is note that in that division. The interbiblical period with respect to the political aspect. Remember, they're still being ruled by foreigners. Zedekiah was the last king. 586, he was taken into captivity. They were ruled first by the Babylons, then they came back under the Persians, ruled by the Persians, and Alexander the Great conquers the world, and they're ruled by the Greeks, the Greek Empire, and then Rome takes the then known world, and it's Roman rule from that time on. So all of that is there, and I just want to mention under the Seleucid supremacy, there's a man that we'll mention later. He was a Syrian king. This man is mentioned in 1st and 2nd Maccabees, and he's the worst oppressor of Israel, probably up until Hitler. And he's very significant in Jewish history, and it's Antiochus IV, or Antiochus Epiphanes, as he was known. I'll spell it for you. It's just like it sounds. Antiochus, Antiochus, Antiochus. Epiphanes, Epiphanes. As king, he ruled over Syria, the Syrian part of Alexander's empire. After Alexander the Great died, his empire was divided. One of the empires was the Syrian or Seleucid dynasty, which, by the way, that dynasty included Egypt and Palestine, as well as Syria. He was a cruel oppressor, and he tried to Hellenize the Jews, take away their religion, had them sacrificing to idols and false gods. And 1st Maccabees, by the way, speaks of the abomination of desolation, which Jesus spoke of later, which means it isn't fulfilled yet. The Jew thought that was it. See, the Jew knew the prophecy of Daniel. So the author of Maccabees, and this is not inspired scripture, But it is, 1st and 2nd Maccabees, a fairly reliable history of what happened between the Testaments, that is, the 2 centuries before Christ. He mentions the abomination of desolation in here when Antiochus Epiphanes sacrificed a pig on the altar, the great altar, Hebrew altar. Of course, that was the abomination of desolation, they thought. Then Jesus later in Matthew 24 tells us when we see the abomination of desolation in the holy place, then you better flee, because things are going to get rough. So obviously, this was only a partial fulfillment of Daniel's prophecy in chapter 9 of Daniel. Point is, if you're serious about the Old Testament or New Testament or Christianity, you don't want to do like the Catholics, quote this as Scripture to prove their doctrines of purgatory or whatever, but the history, at least of the Maccabees, ought to be read once and then you know what it's all about. This is where we get a lot of the information of what took place, as well as the rise of some of the beliefs. But anyway, I'm just mentioning that on your syllabus, that under the Seleucid dynasty, which is 198 to 167 BC, the Jews under the Maccabees, and remember these books are called 1st and 2nd Maccabees, the Jews under the Maccabees revolted against their Syrian overlords. We'll say more about it later. The Jews actually ruled their own land for that short period. We often say that the Jews have never had a king since Zedekiah, and they'll never have another one until Jesus comes, and that's true. And they've always been under foreign domination, and that's true. But in the Maccabean revolt, which we'll say more about later, they actually, for that short period, were able to rule their own land. But it was still under Syrian permission, because had the Syrians really wanted to, they had enough army and all to have taken over again, but they felt like it wasn't worth it. The Maccabees, the Jews, were such warriors. They let them rule, and the priests ruled, so they had no king. Never have a king till Jesus. So I wanted to point that out. It goes under that period on your outline. They ruled from 167 to 63 BC. In 63, Pompey, the Roman general, Pompey, Pompey, he took Palestine. And so it came under Roman rule from 63 BC. Also in this period on your outline, in 37 BC, Herod the Great begins to rule, the one who tried to kill the baby Jesus. And he's appointed by the Romans, and the Maccabees no longer rule. Now all of that was under Seleucid supremacy, Maccabean period there on your outline. Just some highlights. So when we mention it later under the religious wars and whatever, you'll know what we're talking about. Now remember, Israel did not appear in the New Testament in full bloom out of a vacuum. All of these foreign governments and their religions and ideas, you see, were ruling over the little land of Palestine. And it helps you to understand some of the things when you get to the New Testament. That brings us to the religious background. And now we're going to see the rise of the Jewish religious sects and the development of legalistic Judaism. That's point B on your outline, the religious background, the rise of the Jewish sects, the development of legalistic Judaism. See, up till the time of Ezra and Nehemiah, Jesus, if he'd come on the scene in the time of Ezra and Nehemiah, he would have not been condemning Judaism as being legalistic. But when he comes on the scene in the New Testament, he has little more than contempt for the religion of his day, institutional religion. And if he were here today, he'd have the same attitude. And that bothers people when you say that. Sometimes they get in here and it bothers them. I can't understand how they get in here and it would bother them, because we say it all the time. Now, there are a lot of sects here, and there are various ones that we'll look at. We've got the Hasmoneans, who are the Maccabees, the Hasidim, Essenes, Pharisees, Sadducees, Zealots. You know, one of Jesus' disciples was a zealot, religio-political party. But when he became a disciple of Jesus, he was a zealot for the Lord and not for the state, the Jewish state any longer. See, things change in this dispensation, and a lot of people don't seem to realize that, and so they get out and agitate politically, look down upon us because we don't run around voting and politicking. And that we teach that there are two kingdoms. We belong to the one that's from above, and we don't elect or participate in the one below, but we obey it. We pray for it, as Jesus said to do. And Jesus himself, remember, said, my kingdom's not of this world. If it were, my servants would be like Simon used to be, zealots, because they were fighters. We'll say more about that when we get to them. So first of all, under the religious background, we've been looking at the political background that shaped Israel's thinking and culture to some extent. And that can be for the good, like the Maccabees revolted against Hellenism. In the Old Testament period, it's good to revolt against anyone who would impose upon you something like Antiochus Epiphanes tried. In our day, we don't submit, but we just don't resist either. That's Jesus' teaching in the Sermon on the Mount. Now, in order to understand the sects, the various Jewish sects, we have to now look at the Maccabean revolt that we've mentioned already. The Maccabean revolt. The Maccabeans came to be called Maccabeans. They were called the Hasmoneans. That's Hasmoneans. Sometimes you'll see it in your reading as Asmoneans. They leave the H off. Now the Hasmoneans were a priestly family. We're talking about 2 centuries before Christ now. A priestly family from Modin, M-O-D-I-N, in Judea. And they were faithful followers of the God of Israel and the laws of Moses. They were not legalists, they were faithful followers. And that name is derived from Hashmon, H-A-S-M-O-N, Hashmon, who was a priest in the Maccabean family. Hashmon. They came to be called the Hasmoneans from Hashmon. Until, and it's a very interesting account, until one day Antiochus Epiphanes ordered the Israelites to stop sacrificing to their God. And that's just one thing he required. When we talk about the Hellenizing of Palestine, he brought in all the Greek culture and the games and the athletics, the naked races, swimming events, you name it, the music, the literature, the art, everything the Greeks were known for. Of course, Antiochus Epiphanes is not Greek, he's Syrian. He's king of Syria, but it's the Greek culture that's motivating Hollywood and all of the so-called culture today. It goes back to Greece. In fact, when you think of Greece, you think of culture. You don't think of spiritual things, except maybe they're pagan gods, like a Venus without an arm and so on. So chapter 2, when Antiochus Epiphanes requires the priests to start sacrificing, Mattathias, M-A-T-T-A-T-H-I-A-S, a priest, was so zealous for true worship, true sacrifice in the law, he just told the Syrian captain when he came and ordered them to sacrifice to the pagan gods on God's altar, and they had already built other altars, that he said in a loud voice, he didn't say, is there any way I can get out of this? Mattathias the priest said in a loud voice, though all the nations that are under the king's dominion obey him and fall away, everyone from the religion of their fathers, and give consent to his commandment, that is to sacrifice to pagan gods, yet I and my sons and my brethren walk in the covenant of our fathers, and God forbid that we should forsake the law and ordinances. And we will not hearken to the king's words, or go from our religion either to the right hand or to the left. They're fanatics, you see, like Faith Assembly. They don't love anybody. Now, when he had left speaking these words loudly, there came one of the Jews, a Jewish priest in the sight of all, to sacrifice on the altar, which was at Modin, according to Antiochus Epiphanes' commandment. Which thing when Mattathias saw, he was inflamed with zeal, righteous indignation. And his reins trembled, neither could he forbear to show his anger according to judgment. Wherefore he ran and slew the priest upon the altar. And also he slew the king's captain who stood there. He overthrew the pagan altars and fled to the wilderness, and multitudes fled with him. They raised an army, such an army, my friends, that they actually took Palestine from the Syrian overlords. They revolted in 167 BC. That was the revolt when Mattathias slew the priest on the altar and the guard who guarded the altars and temple. They fled to the wilderness, 167. And one of his sons was named Judas Maccabeus. Judas Maccabeus, Maccabeus. And Maccabeus means hammer. Hammer. Judas the Hammer is what he was called. Judas Maccabeus. And that's where they get their name, the Maccabees. And in 165, 2 years later, Judas Maccabeus leads in the capture of Jerusalem. And they kept it from 167 till, well, actually 37, time of Herod, you might say. Over a century. And that's the origin of what you hear around the institutional church's Christmas. You ever hear of Hanukkah? This is where it starts. It's the Feast of Dedication. Hanukkah means dedication. And the Jews celebrate it down to this day. That's why you'll hear the Jews talk about exchanging presents, lighting candles. And, you know, from a distance you think they're celebrating Christmas. But they're not. They're celebrating Hanukkah, and they'll tell you the difference right away. So the Hebrew term, as we've said, means dedication, and it's called the Feast of Dedication, or Hanukkah, which is a Jewish holiday and festival celebrated for 8 days in commemoration of the cleansing and dedication of the temple and rebuilt altar under Judas Maccabeus when he recaptured Jerusalem in 165 BC. From the Syrian Greeks who had defiled the temple and altar. 1 Maccabees 4:38 to 61, 2 Maccabees 10:6 and 7. Feast of Dedication is celebrated in December. It's also called the Feast of Lights, in case you run into that. The Feast of Lights, because of the use of candles and lights in its celebration. In the homes, in the synagogues, lights. Now, the only explanation on that is I've read Josephus, and he said it's because when Judas Maccabeus took Jerusalem back from the Syrians and was able to keep it, it was just more than they ever expected to happen. And so it was like a great light shining upon Israel. So that's why it's sometimes called the Feast of Lights, according to Josephus. Now, Hanukkah is a community holiday celebrated with entertainments, exchange of gifts, parties, just like Christmas, with a little wine tipping. Some synagogues display large menorahs, which are lampstands. Now, in Israel today, there is an emphasis upon the patriotic aspect of Hanukkah rather than its religious. That is, they're both there, but the emphasis is upon its patriotic aspect. And they have processions, thousands of people who carry candles, you know, the Feast of Lights. Songs about freedom in Hebrew, you know, they sing songs about freedom. And in their schools, they have plays depicting the bravery of Judas Maccabeus and the Jews. All right, let's come now to the Jewish sects. That's the Maccabean background. All right, the first one, the Hasidians, or Hasidim. Hasideans. Our plural is Hasidim. The Hasidians are Hasidim. Most of what you'll read outside of a Bible dictionary will never put the C before the H in Hebrew when it's that guttural sound, Hasidim. But in the Bible dictionaries, generally they will. So on the outline, it's like you'll find it in most of your reading with just the H. That's true of any Hebrew word that starts with what is the Het, H-E-T-H. Now this is a Jewish sect before Christ. We're trying to find out where Jewish legalism started. The Hasidim is from the word Hasid, C-H-A-S-I-D, Hasid, which means pious. This was a name, the pious ones, a name given to those Orthodox Jews who opposed the Hellenization of Palestine. And you have them mentioned in 1 Maccabees 2:42, 7:13. Now Maccabees is written in Greek, translated into English. And in the Greek, they won't be called Hasidim, they'll be called Asadion. But if you look at them written, you can see it's the same group they're talking about. Now that sect of pious Jews exists even till today. And I know you can't see this far away. See those black garments, black beards, big broad-brimmed hats? You say, I can't see that too well. All right, look at the old order German Baptist. I'm not trying to be funny. I'm just saying where you can see this, your old order German Baptist, certainly your old order Amish. Beards, big black broad-brimmed hats, long coats way down to the knees. You see these today, riding around the buggies and so forth. The only way you'd know you were looking at Orthodox, extreme Orthodox Jews, and not a German Baptist, old order, or an Amish, that is for the average person, they could tell the difference themselves, is the Hasidim have little pigtails. They don't cut their hair, but sometimes they're up under their hats so you wouldn't know, you see. But these do have little pigtails. Where we have sideburns, they have little pigtails. So they still exist today. They're way back 2 centuries before Christ. Now what's their origin? Their origin is uncertain. I came all the way over here to write in my notes, uncertain. Well, I can't help you, because I did all the research and nobody knows. I saved you the research, so wipe your tears and keep writing. Their origin is uncertain, but they existed as a religious group before the Maccabean period. And it's suggested they arose soon after Alexander the Great's conquest of the world, including Palestine. And of course, the strict religionists would withdraw from this superimposition of Greek culture upon the Jewish state. Because you see, the rulers come in with all of their games and their plays and their cards and their new drinks and movies and television, the whole bit. Whatever they had in those days. Because their plays were as bad as some of the stuff you see today, if you watch it. So they existed before the Maccabees. They are described in 1 Maccabees 1:63, 2 Maccabees 6:18 and following, and in the book of Judith, Judith, it's in the Apocrypha, Judith, 12:2, and in Josephus, book 14, chapter 4, verse 3. The book of Maccabees are history. Remember, we're not recommending the Apocrypha alongside your Bible. This is just a history book. There are books in here that are fiction, but the point being, there's some good reading in the book of Wisdom and Ecclesiasticus, but don't treat it as scripture. It's just what the Jews, the pious Jew, thought religiously and so forth, between the testaments. After all, he was saved. The Maccabees, Judas, you see, he was conquering in the name of the Lord. And Mattathias refused to sacrifice to the pagan gods. And so in the Old Testament economy, these are heroes to God. The point being, you can learn some things, but don't treat it as Scripture. Just treat it for what it is. So their origin is before the Maccabees. Now, they were active supporters of the Maccabees religiously, but they had little interest in politics, and later separated from them when the emphasis by the Maccabees was more political than religious. The Hasidim were supporters of the Maccabees. That brings us to another group on your outline, the Essenes, E-S-S-E-N-E-S. Now, what does the name mean? Again, it seems to mean pious ones, just like the Hasidim means pious ones. You can get other ideas from books on the Qumran community and Dead Sea Scrolls and so forth, but we'll leave it at that, pious ones. And the Qumran community, that's Q-U-M-R-A-N, Q-U-M-R-A-N, that everybody has at least read once in a newspaper, magazine, or a book. In 1946, you remember, 3 shepherds discovered what came to be called the Dead Sea Scrolls. Most who've delved into this, the archaeology of it and everything else, believe the Qumran community that was discovered in 1946 and the Dead Sea Scrolls in that area were a community of Essenes. A good book on the subject is Amazing Dead Sea Scrolls, if you just want to read about Dead Sea Scrolls and Qumran community. Their origin, too, is uncertain. But it's believed they were descendants of that portion of the previous group, the Hasidim, who rather than fight, fled to the wilderness during Antiochus Epiphanes' persecutions. Most believe the Essenes are a part of the Hasidim who refused to fight with Judas Maccabeus. They were, like us, non-resistant. Matthew 5. They believed even in the Old Testament they weren't to fight, but to be pious. The Essenes were a brotherhood, a monastic community that devoted themselves to the ascetic life. They were self-supporting. They were zealous for the law and apparently copied it. You see, there was many caves over there filled with scrolls way back from 1st and 2nd centuries before Christ. The importance of the Dead Sea Scrolls is that for centuries the liberals have been trying to tear the Old Testament apart and saying it's not reliable. But the Dead Sea Scrolls, 2 centuries before Christ, that's the oldest. Now, original copies we're talking about. Not original in the sense that we had Isaiah's hand, but the copyists, it's a long and detailed story, but when they would copy a page of Scripture, they had an elaborate process by where they counted down and counted over. And they'd have a listener and a reader. After it was copied very carefully, then they would read it back, and then they would check. They would say, a lamed is 3 down, 4 over. And they go through a line that way. They wouldn't even trust themselves with a word. So what I'm saying is we have a very reliable Scripture because of the way it was copied. That's a whole story in itself. You got books you can read on that. But the scrolls discovered in the Dead Sea area, in those caves in 1946, are the oldest copies now we have. You see, before the oldest copy we had was 1000 AD. That's this side. The oldest copy of the Old Testament we had is 1,000 years after Christ. Now we got one way back 2 centuries, or at least 1st century before Christ. And they confirm. The point is that Isaiah reads in the oldest copy we found like the one we've had, that the oldest copy was 1,000 years this side of Christ, which means that it has been faithfully transmitted. It was one of the greatest confirmations to the arguments and views of the conservatives that has ever come about. And so they copied the scriptures, the Essenes. They were very meticulous, and they were zealous for the law. And so that was part of their occupation. You can read all about it in a book on Dead Sea Scrolls. But the reason that we're stressing it here, besides the fact it's one of those pious groups that arose between the Testaments, we're trying to find out where legalism started, that Jesus confronted. The reason we stress about the Essenes and their community over there, there's a whole new theology that Jesus was an Essene. He came out of that community. Or John the Baptist did, or at least they were influenced by it. The only problem is the Essenes were ascetic. They were monastic. They didn't marry. They did not allow women in their community. They adopted boys. That's the way they got their converts. And of course, there are a lot of orphans in those days, much more than today. They adopted boys, and they did not go up to the temple to worship. That was anathema. That was dead institutional religion by their time. And so they stayed and had their own worship services. But the point is that so many are trying to relate Jesus and John the Baptist. See, John the Baptist came out of the desert, and they lived in the desert, Qumran community. They forget, though, as we've said, that Jesus would not fit into their scheme of things. You see, Jesus taught against asceticism. He constantly rebuked legalism. He ate with sinners, which they would never do, and he worshipped at the temple. So he couldn't have been an Essene. And quite naturally, they disappear by the 2nd century A.D. I say quite naturally because monastic communities always disappear. There have been a lot of groups tried it. Well, you say, what about the Roman Catholics? Well, look, you've got a segment that are monastic. Most Catholics are not monastic, but the whole group monastic. Like the Old Order Brethren, one group was monastic. And you can go look at the runs of their religious community. It existed for a few years, but you see, without marriage as God ordained, then everything eventually will come to a standstill. You won't have to do a thing. There's so much on Pharisees, so I'm going to stop there tonight. Let you digest what you've got. We'll start with the Pharisees and those who didn't believe in the resurrection, and they became Sadducees. I mean, if you don't believe in the resurrection and spirits and prophetic scripture, which they didn't, they were the liberals of their day. You see, not to believe in those things makes you sad, you see. So they came to be called the Sadducees. I don't know if really that's the origin of that word. I don't think so.